Come back here and share presentation. Okay, so let's just finish up this conversation about these different areas of psychology that we'll definitely be looking at back here and share presentation. Hold on. Okay, so let's just finish up this conversation about these different areas of psychology that we'll definitely be looking at. Okay, there we go. If you remember last Wednesday, we finished up or was talking about humanistic psychology. And the main points I want to make sure that we get out of this is that what humanistic psychology was trying to do is make it so human existence wasn't so determined. If you remember when we talked about Freudian theory, all of your behavior is determined by basic biological drives. When we looked at behaviorism, the reason why we're here is due to a conditioning history. In other words, in both of those frameworks, if we're looking at it from perspective of why we're in this class, we didn't choose to be here. It was all due to either a learned history or it was due to your ego figuring out how to satisfy some internal drives that it has. Okay. And humanistic theory is very much made the argument of free will coming from existential philosophy and really feels like what the goal of being human is to seek out our full potential. And what inhibits us from doing so is not being able to survive or barely surviving within a given context. So not being able to take care of like our biological needs, our social needs, our safety needs, and our esteem needs, and our self needs. And because we struggle with keeping these very basic survival needs in place, it can be a situation in which we don't always achieve a full and complete understanding of who we are as a human being. Okay. And we will see again in cultural psychology or cross cultural psychology, there can be an argument that, for example, especially in, for example, third world countries where there's a struggle for survival, that cycle might be what keeps that country from progressing any further. But then there can also be some other arguments for that because even in a third world country, they're surviving, they're growing, they're developing. They may not have the resources a first world country has, but they're still surviving and have survived for millennia as well. So this idea will return to about the advancement of a given culture and advancement of a society and the competition and reliance on resources to meet our survival needs so that we can then go and become a fully developed human being. We'll look at this argument as we move along. Okay. So, okay. So, two other branches of psychology that really kind of developed independent of these major fields, starting in about the 1900s. The two fields are social psychology and developmental psychology. Okay. We will be spending a lot of time within the field of social psychology when we start talking about things like prejudice and discrimination, compliance to authority, social cognitions, how we influence our thoughts about other people, especially other people who are not similar to ourselves. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time within this field of social psychology. But really, what social psychology is trying to study is the relationship between an individual and a group. and how a group influences an individual, and how the individual can influence the group. Because as we will see when we get into this section on culture, culture is very much driven by themes from individuals. So when we talk, for example, about fads, usually that those fads are started by a small group of individuals and then grow into something larger. Okay. And so we'll see these different influences. But the two areas of that really drive the field of psychology is, one is what's called situationalism. Okay. And then the idea of subjective experience. Okay. Situationalism states that what drives the majority of behavior is not a person's personality or attitude or belief system, but the social context which the person finds themselves in. Okay. Subjective experience. So we can predict behavior better by looking at the situation instead of the individual within the situation, is what that first part says. But what we're also interested in is a person's subjective experience. How are they experiencing a given situation? So I kind of want to play how this works, okay? If we were in a live classroom, we were all together on campus, okay? What would predict your behavior when you walked into that classroom is the classroom setting. So the majority of the time, the students will sit at desks facing a screen and a professor. The professor sits at the front of the classroom and conducts the class. So we all behave the same way in this context, okay? And interestingly, one time I had a class that was having a hard time understanding this idea of situationalism and the prediction of behavior. So one class, I had just one desk in the classroom. It was a student desk, and I was sitting in it. And I had all of the other desks and chairs removed from the classroom. And that situation was so foreign to them that a lot of them just walked out because they weren't sure what to do in that given situation. Do you stand there? Do you go look for a chair? And they had a really difficult time understanding how to behave within that unfamiliar classroom situation. Okay. Now, with that being said, regardless of us all behaving the same in that classroom condition, we all have a different subjective experience of what's happening in that classroom. So, for example, some students are in the class because they have to fulfill a general ed requirement and they're just there. They're going to kind of sleep through the class. Some are super motivated and love the subject area, so they're excited to be there. If we look at personality traits, extroverts tend to be in a classroom setting because they get that social interaction. So that fulfills that personality trait. For introverts, it's the ability to gain some internal knowledge that they'll process on their own at some other time period. Okay. So while behavior itself can be predicted by the situation, a person's subjective experience of why they behave the way they did in that context differs from person to person based on personality and different ways of thinking. How this will get into culture, again, if we look across cultures, most situations, people will come into the classroom and sit where they're supposed to and look for the lectern and whatnot. But culture really also plays a role in why a person is there. So if we look at our more materialistic culture here in the United States, a lot of individuals go to college because there's an assumption that they'll have a better income or a better quality of life and get a better job because of being here. If we look at some other cultures, such as Germany or something like that, It's all about becoming a fully developed person and becoming an educated person and understanding the dynamics of the world and how it is. So based on cultural influences, can determine why a person, for example, goes to a college classroom in the first place. So we'll get into these topics as we move along, and we'll see how culture influences things like prejudice and discrimination, how authority figures influence behavior, and those types of things. And we will see that there's some cultural differences based on the dynamics of that culture. And I'll just bring one up really quick. And if we look at prejudice and discrimination here in the United States, versus prejudice and discrimination in Canada. Okay. When we look at here in the United States, many of our prejudices are based on skin color. So the whiteness or the blackness or the brownness of the individual determines the prejudices that that person will receive. Okay. In Canada, however, prejudices are largely determined on language barriers, boundaries. I shouldn't say barriers, boundaries. So, for example, English speaking Canadians are much like white American citizens here in the United States. Okay. Whereas French speaking Canadians get the same type of treatment that Black Americans here in the United States get treated. So, again, this is the idea how culture influences even things that we become prejudiced or discriminatory against. In Canada, it's based on language. Here in the United States, it's largely based on appearance and skin color. Okay, so that's just some differences. Okay, the other field that we will be speaking of here in a couple of weeks is developmental psychology, also called human growth and development, lifespan psychology. We're trying to get away from the term developmental because we want to explore the entire lifespan. The term developmental assumes that we're only going to look at children, okay? But in either way, what we're interested in developmental or lifespan psychology is how people change over time in three very specific domains: physically, cognitively, and socio-emotionally, okay? And when it comes to culture, we'll definitely be paying attention to how children are acculturated into their given culture that they're in. So we'll look at that very specifically within this domain. So we'll look at, for example, how parenting, social systems influence the perceptions of a child and how they develop and grow. And we'll speak about how different cultures genderize children, how do cultures develop cognitively, and those types of things. So we will spend some time in this section talking about the development of human beings as we change over our lifespan, but we'll be paying really close attention to how culture influences that developmental trajectory. Okay. The next two areas of psychology are really are recent developments in the field of psychology. The first one is called the cognitive approach, and the second one is the biological approach. Roughly cognitive approach 1960s, biological approach in the 1980s. Okay. What happened in the 1960s, especially here in the United States, is there became a huge dissatisfaction with the behaviorist approach. Remember, the behaviorist approach says we should only study those things which we can observe. And what can we observe? We can observe stimuli in the environment and the behavioral response of the organism. And so anything in between, thoughts, decision-making, all of those things are just a byproduct of stimulus response associations, okay? And literally, B.F. Skinner said that consciousness is just a byproduct of learning processes, okay? But during the 1960s, we get the introduction of computer systems. We get this idea that human behavior isn't as predictable as behaviorists thought it was. Language is much more complex than what a behaviorist could explain it as. And so we get what's called a cognitive revolution, where we start to re-enter the study of the mental processes of human existence. Okay. Now, what they're going to do, though, is they are going to take a lot of the scientific methodology of the behaviorists and apply them to thought processes. Okay. And again, when we get to this section talking about the way people think about their life, we'll focus on things like what's called social cognition. And that's how we think about our world. And especially when we think about our social relationships with each other. We'll talk about things called identity, perceptions of self, perceptions of others, and how those are all influenced. Again, I'll go back to that topic of culture. So, how does culture influence the way we view, for example, gender, sexuality, people who are different from us, social economic statuses? All of those different ways are really largely influenced by the culture we live in. Okay. Um, so we'll look at that process. And then in the 1980s, with the implementation of brain scans, especially what's called functional MRIs and PET scans, and our ability to pierce into the brain and the nervous system and look what is active while people are doing certain tasks, we get what's now called the biological approach or the brain approach to psychology. That the brain really is, I mentioned this when we talked about some of the philosophies, the brain we really see as our CPU, that it is processing how we should respond to the world, and there's activity that we can see that is associated with that. So it's kind of our physical structure of how we navigate the world. When we come to culture, again, we will see that even people in cross-cultural studies may have different activity in the brain, even though they might be thinking about the same topic. Okay, I'm going to leave that as a cliffhanger because it gets a little bit more complicated than just that simple term. So I want to use some examples later on in the course to really show how there can be people who are human beings, because they're raised in two different cultures. They may have different brain activity dependent upon what they, even if they're thinking or doing the same task. Okay, so we'll get to this a little bit later in the course and the complexity behind it, but it is having, again, a huge influence on the study of psychology. I think I mentioned in our Monday class, my dissertation was on social processes, but I still had to have a chapter in my dissertation about the associated neurological processes that are associated with things like identity. And when you think about who you are as a person, and loneliness, which is a motivational, emotional process that hopes to drive us to seek out social connection with other people. Okay, so we'll look at these different brain regions and how they're associated with different aspects of the human mind. Okay, now if you look at the majority of psychologists today, albeit a social psychologist like myself or a clinical counseling psychologist, we are now really taking on a kind of this broader model of understanding human behavior, and it's called the biopsychosocial model, okay, where we really have come to understand that the way to understand individual human behavior is we have to look at the associated biological processes. Where are they physically developed? their brain functioning, all of those different biological aspects. Are they getting their biological needs met in a given situation? And then we look at the social aspects. What are the social, what are the relationships that are being developed in that? What is a person's identity with a given situation? And then, of course, we look at the psychological processes, how people think and interpret a given situation. So if you think about the kind of contemporary psychology today, it kind of combines all of these different separate models that we've talked about to really try and give a view of what drives individual behavior from a psychological, biological, and social perspective. All right, well, I made that through that quickly. Okay, let me think. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I told you we'd be a short class today, but we went over